If you've worked in any firm, you probably know that despite the repetition of trying to teach you by osmosis, by just putting work in front of you and hoping you'll figure it out, it doesn't actually work that way. People now change their jobs and careers more often than they used to, and that means that we have a shorter time with any given employee. We're going to have to get them up to speed faster, and using the old way of hoping and praying that osmosis will work just won't work. We're going to have to invest time in bringing people out of rotation. This may mean that we're going to have to take our top performers off the front lines to get them to train our newest employees. Why? We want them brought up to speed as fast as possible so that they can make a bigger impact. This week, we're talking with Matt Gjertsen. Currently, he runs Better Everyday Studios, which has a mission of enabling as many people as possible to achieve their maximum potential by transforming how companies view learning and development. Matt didn't start out at Better Everyday Studios. He first spent 8 years as an instructor pilot in the U.S. Air Force before moving on to corporate learning and development as the manager of training and development for SpaceX. After 4 years with SpaceX, he went on to found Better Everyday Studios. Today, we're going to talk to him about focusing on the behaviors that will produce better results and how to create the right environmental context for trainings. We're going to talk about how we can focus on the behaviors that produce better results and creating the right environmental context for effective training. Stick around until the end for Matt's one big tip on training. I'm John Strohmeyer, and this is the 5-Star Counsel Podcast. The market for legal services is shifting, and lawyers who don't adapt will be left behind. This podcast gives you a competitive edge in today's market by sharing the client service lessons you probably didn't learn in law school or in law practice. Let's start the show. Hey 5-Star listeners, before we start, I want to tell you about our amazing sponsor, Smithai. Smithai is a virtual receptionist service for small businesses with a specialty in working with solo and small law firms. I signed up with them within weeks of starting my firm because they are affordable for even the smallest solo practice. Their friendly receptionists respond to potential clients in Spanish or English, screen and schedule new leads, and can even take payments. And now they're answering calls 24 hours a day. So even when you're asleep, they're still working. Even beyond the phone, they've got live agents and chatbots ready to capture leads on your website, by text, and by Facebook Messenger. Smith's friendly gatekeepers can staff your front line so you can work uninterrupted. You can finally have the peace of mind that while you're working, you're not missing out on future work. Plans start at just $70 a month for calls and $100 a month for chats. Smithai is offering a free trial, and our podcast listeners get an extra $100 discount code with promo code 5-Star. That's FIVESTAR. Sign up and learn more at www.smith.ai. Don't let another day go by. Try Smithai. Hey, Matt Gjertsen, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I'm really excited.
Matt, I had you on. We got connected. Doesn't even matter how we got connected, but the point of this conversation is training is so important, and many firms, I know all of the law firms I've been at, effectively assumed you'll learn by osmosis. You'll learn by watching us do things, and that doesn't work. And even at the last two firms I was at before I started my own, I'd gone in knowing, look, I didn't get a lot of guidance. Maybe if I asked for examples of what was good, they would at least hand me some documents of, we're proud of this. It may not be the exemplar of the best we can do, but at least it's a reasonable expectation of what we can do. It was all no, don't worry, you'll learn on the job. If we don't tell you something's going wrong, you're fine. And because podcast is an audio medium, people can't see that you're kind of smiling along knowing that this doesn't work, and you're going to help us figure out, well, I was at the Four Seasons before law school. I got trained effectively. I was, kind of coached and also corralled for my first 3 months before they turned me loose. Matt, how can we build out training programs so that our law firms can operate more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why I was smiling and nodding that the audience can't see is because it's so true that it doesn't work, and specifically, it doesn't work right now or today in the new world. Because if you think back, I always say that companies. I've mainly worked in startups, in the startup space, and companies realize that they need training at one of two moments. Either it's when they hit scale and all of a sudden they're hiring tons of people a lot faster than they ever expected, or it's when their first generation of workers leaves and they realize like, oh wow. And so, like there's all this knowledge that they had that I didn't even realize it. And I think that's why it's specifically that whole learn by osmosis doesn't work today, is because that turnover is just so much faster and so much earlier. So, people are rarely staying in companies for 10, 15, 20, 30 years anymore. And so as the workforce starts to move around a lot, and then as the environment in which you operate, your workforce changes so quickly, that old model just doesn't work. And so you need to have a way to distill down the information that you want people to get much faster and get it to them in a format that they can absorb really, really quickly. And so that's why, especially in the small business world, I think, historically, like you said, Four Seasons or Disney or these like major organizations have invested in this historically. And now is the time when smaller businesses really need to do it and take advantage of it. And the great news is that I think because of technological changes, it's becoming ever easier to do this today. It doesn't need to be a giant, like 6 week send everybody away to a big formal camp kind of thing. It can be something that's a lot smaller and more impactful on a smaller scale.
Right. I mean, thinking back to what happened when I got hired by the Four Seasons, it was very clearly that I was hired for a 90-day trial period. And that was going to be training. The first few days were just everybody from every department who was new. You were getting standards and culture training. This is how we generally operate. It wasn't just fill out the forms. And then it moved on to weeks of training in my department. And I was not let loose on the front desk, even with supervision, for another 2 or 3 weeks, which is crazy. Like, here I was, I'd been hired, and it was a month before I was allowed in front of guests. And that was because they were teaching me how to use the computers, how to use the computers their way, what was expected. And it wasn't me studying by myself. I had a trainer who was taken out of rotation,
Yes.
which, I mean, again, thinking about all of this and how most professional services firms do things, it's now that you filled out your compliance paperwork, here's a pile of things to do. Can you have them done yesterday?
Yes, yes, yeah, and I think there's two things to focus on of what you mentioned there. One of them is bringing people out of rotation. I think that's a really important aspect that more companies need to think about. Is how do you take your top performers and take even 10% of their time, 15% of their time to train the next generation or to train the new people. There's lots of different places out there where you can get kind of train the trainer kind of sessions of, almost what we're going to be having a discussion with right now is getting people to understand how do you impart knowledge to someone. If you make that kind of like the highest level of achievement that you can have in your organization, that's really impactful. That was the way my first career was in the Air Force. I was an instructor pilot for 10 years in the US Air Force, and that was how they worked. Is you'd start off as a co-pilot, where you were flying, you know, underneath kind of someone else or right next to someone else. Then you'd become an aircraft commander, and then eventually you'd become an instructor pilot. And so being an instructor was seen as that higher level thing. So I think that's one thing that organizations really need to think about, is how do you take those top performers and get them and incentivize them to pass that knowledge on. And there's a lot of things we could dive deeper into that, but I don't think that's necessarily the core of what we want to talk about today. The other thing I think that's important to note is that when most people hear what you just described, they think, I never have time for that, or my company doesn't have time for that. We can't afford to bring somebody into the organization and wait a month before we're actually getting anything out of them. And I think that's where we can start to reframe the conversation of, you don't have to wait that long. It doesn't have to be something that training, and in fact, more and more today, training and learning and development isn't something that happens over there when you're not doing your job. It's something that you do while you're doing your job. And a big focus of a lot of the industry is called learning in the flow of work. And so there's a lot of newer tools out there. A lot of learning management systems are more designed to create almost like a YouTube kind of like feel, where when you think about anything that you're trying to learn in your day-to-day life, you just pull up a YouTube video, find the minute and a half segment that you want, just watch that and then move on. That's the way most of the learning industry is focusing on right now, of generating this micro content that you deliver to people, not in just like a whole giant session that lasts a month, but you kind of sprinkle it into someone's time so that they can start actually doing things and maybe generating revenue for you, but you do it in a controlled way so that you kind of unlock pieces, coming back to the customer experience. You make sure they've had the training that you want them to have before you put them in front of a client. But that doesn't mean they can't be doing some paperwork before they get in front of the client, so you kind of teach them as they go, so that you can unlock some of their potential. And so then I think the question comes down to, okay, so how do we what content do we generate? And that's the really where it starts to get really interesting.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack in there. I'm going to start with the bringing people out of rotation, because it was true at the Four Seasons when I was there. The person who trained me was one of the better front desk agents, because I came on there. I got some basic training there, then went over, learned, phone bank exchange or PBX, was trained by somebody different there. But the trainers, I think, had like there was an incentive there of your hourly rate was increased for all hours, not just your training hours,
Yes.
to incentivize, no, we want more people doing this. And also, there were certain incentives that you had to, upsell rooms, do other things at the front desk. So this was meant to compensate, like, oh, we're going to take you off that time. So when you're not doing it, there is the value of passing on that knowledge.
Yeah, I
So you
think
don't feel like you're being cheated.
exactly. I think that's 100% right. There's different models to follow to do it. I think that's an excellent one, where you basically certify someone as a trainer, and it should be separate from being a high performer. It should be, you are a high performer and you have shown competency in the ability to train people. And if you can do that, if make it something that they have to work at, and then once you do that, yeah, then you can give them increased compensation 100%. Another way to do it, depending on, this is kind of the model that the Air Force followed, is it was, when people are out as a frontline flyer, or frontline pilot, they're incredibly busy and gone all the time. And so there might be a period of their life where that's fun. And then there's a period of their life where they'd rather stay home a little bit more. And so then they sign up to become an instructor. And, the same thing can be true in any walk of life. Maybe it's not deployments, but it's just number of meetings or hours worked, or whatever. If there's, being a trainer can be one of those stages in the life cycle of an employee, where they need to take a step back for a little bit, or can't be as engaged for a little bit. And so you use their services differently, use their,
Right.
their expertise differently.
Yeah. And then, so the other thing you brought up was the never having time. And I agree, before it was very hard to say, all right, well, what are we going to do? And how am I going to convey all of this? But now that we've been at home for a year, we've learned, pretty much everybody's learned how to use Zoom or
Yes.
something else.
Yeah.
The screencast method for just here's the 5-minute task. This is how we do it. And it's, you know, recording your videos wherever you are, just to say, here's the basics of what to do. So I know there's a lot more to it, but even the resistance to doing a 2-minute screencast on this is what I'm looking at. What else
Yeah.
should we be thinking about there?
No, I think that's a big part of it. I think that's the start, is getting people used to that. And almost all organizations, almost all learning management systems are designed to facilitate that now. And it can even go farther than that. I think some of the best the best learning management systems today have this kind of, it's almost like a video coaching module where you can record a client interaction, say, that you want them to respond to, and they have to record, the learner, the new employee has to train themselves responding to that person, and then they can re-record it, they can re-watch it, they can do it as many times as they want, and then you as the experienced person or the boss or whoever it is can review it, give them feedback, can grade them. Some of the software that's out there actually allows kind of like peer grading, where you can like see everybody else's if you're onboarding a lot of people. Rehearsal is a software that comes to mind that enables this kind of stuff. But a lot of learning management systems actually have it built in, and so that's becoming a bigger and bigger part of learning development. But I think the key thing here is that you have to figure out, because not everybody, even if you're an expert, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good teacher, right? And I think there's kind of a thing out there in the world that says, the best players make bad coaches, because they're good and they don't necessarily know why they got so good or what makes them good. And so I think that's then the next level to your question of what are we missing, is it's figuring out, okay, what am I going to teach people? What am I going to say in this 2 minutes? How do I narrow it down? And that's where I think, especially in fields like the legal field, where people are so highly educated, I think you tend to have the hardest time figuring out what to cover, because formal education in this country, whether it's high school or university, is all about knowledge, right? It's all about knowledge transfer. And that's what everybody thinks about when they think of training, when they think of learning and development, they think about knowledge transfer. But as soon as we get into companies, we don't care about knowledge anymore. We care about behaviors. And what behavior are people specifically going to do? And so when I talk about learning and learning design, I think about three things. I think about behavior, I think about getting specific, giving context, and then repetition. And so the getting specific has to do with the behavior. And that's where you always start by asking the question, what behavior am I trying to change? That's how you really narrow in. And that's how you get to that 2-minute video, because it's not a big expose on this is how we think about email, right? Or this is the theory behind why we structure meetings the way we structure them. It's just, this is the structure. This is what you need to do to set it up in this format. And so I think that's the first way you start with this stuff, is asking the question, what behavior am I trying to change? And that's how you get specific.
Oh, I mean, it's, to get very off topic for a second, the focusing on the behavior is something that honestly makes things easier, because when you see a result, if you can tie it to a specific behavior instead of trying to tie it into when, I don't like your attitude, it's so much easier to say, oh,
Yes.
when you have this result, this is the problem. I don't care about, your tone or anything else. It's the result of this is XYZ. I need you to work on this. It's not attacking the person. It's kind of pointing
Yeah.
outside of them and say, look, I'm sure you did the best you can. But when I look at this, when I take the time to see what you created, this is the problem. I've gotten occasionally, as an estate planning attorney, I will get client files from other firms transferred over. And there have been times where I get a file and I look at it, say, God, like, they never stapled the documents after they signed them.
Yeah.
No, if this was something you knew about, the result is we've got a document that wasn't stapled and it got stored away and nobody would have noticed it. Probably not going to be a huge issue, but tying that result in, if I had been the attorney there and had known about it, that's one thing to say, look, the result is this. The specific behavior that we're looking for is documents get scanned and then stapled. Like, here's our objective criteria of the specific behaviors. And if you don't, here are the consequences.
Yes. And that's an easy, to your example, or to the point that you were talking about before, it's so easy to take that. Let's say it was a new hire, or that failed to staple the documents. It's so easy to go down that path of deciding why they didn't do it, of
Hmm.
deciding that they were lazy, or they forgot, or they were watching a video, they were on Facebook on their computer while they were working. But you don't know. That's the big. So I think it's 100% right when you talk about performance management and giving feedback as kind of a sidebar. um, Focusing on the behavior is allows you to get rid of all that and make sure you don't make any suppositions about about what you don't know. You don't know what's going on in their head. You don't know what they were doing. Focusing on the behavior really narrows it in of this is what we're doing here.
Right, and it's a lot easier. You're not going to get into a fight you'll never win with
Yeah.
somebody.
Yeah.
Like my
Exactly.
attitude's fine. You're the one. You're the one with the problem.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Uh, so we've got, that was one of the things you talked about, is just distilling it down and focusing on that specific behavior. I mean, I think we started talking about both about context of.
Yes.
It seems to me this is. I would put this as, this is the why of what we're doing. We've talked about what we're doing, and are we now with context trying to say this is the why?
It can be a couple of different things. And so when I think about context, just like there's the question of, in order to get specific, you ask, what behavior are you trying to change? When it comes to context, I just ask, who is the learner? Who is this person that you are trying to teach? What do they know? What do they not know? Where are they going to be applying this information? How are they going to be applying this information? And then I think the what they know falls into that category of the, do they understand why this is important or not? This idea first came. So most of the philosophy that I follow around learning and development actually came a lot from trying to understand how the brain works, and reading books like How Emotions Are Made and The Telltale Brain, and really, the fact that when you're trying to remember how to do something, there's this whole big network in your brain that is firing up and pulling information from all of these different sources. And part of what it's doing, what your brain is doing, is pattern matching. Is it's trying to figure out what to do in this situation, and it's using all of your senses to figure that out. And so context really, in the where this came from, was the idea of so much learning and development, so much corporate learning and development doesn't happen in the workplace. It's traditionally happened at an offsite. You're in a hotel boardroom, or whatever it is. And that's a very different environment than you're going to be trying to apply this knowledge. And so if you take a manufacturing supervisor from a factory and go put them into a hotel conference room for a day to teach them about leadership, it's going to be very unlikely that they're going to remember any of that information when they're trying to apply it out on the production floor, where it's loud and noisy and all that kind of stuff. And so it kind of comes to this. So it starts with the idea of teaching people in the environment in which they're going to be using this information, or as close to it as you can come. Try to find other cues, whether it's visual, auditory, just like the actual, technology that they're interacting with. If they're going to be doing a lot of stuff on their phone, then be training them on their phone, don't versus training them on a desktop. Um, so putting people in the right context, like physically and emotionally, is really important. But then intellectually as well, understanding the context of the intellectual environment that they're coming from, of what information do they know or not know, and that's how you determine what information you need to give them when you're teaching them the behavior that you want them to elicit.
Got it. Wow. Yeah, but it also makes me think about the interviewing mindset of, you also want to interview people where they're going to be working, just to at least make sure that they can operate in that environment. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, we're going to have private conversations. We don't want to be standing out somewhere in public, or even, dear client, uh, we're interviewing somebody at the same time. Would you mind sitting in?
yeah,
That, clearly, that's not going to happen. But getting the same sort of, we want to think about where you are, and it's not, we're doing everything kind of as close to reality as possible. And it brings me back, before this, we were talking about something I'd learned in the Boy Scouts about a training method there, but it's the other aspect that I keep coming back to on that was, it was a low stakes situation in Boy Scouts. Like, if you're learning how, as a child, to fail in a controlled environment. If you don't tie a knot correctly, that's okay. but we can do it where you are and you kind of know what the support is.
Yep.
And so it seems like, well, look, same way we're going to train up on the easy to do things first. We're going to train where you're going to do it. So, moving slowly what this should look like. And so when things are full speed dealing with actual clients, this is what it should look like.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is starting easy, starting slow. That actually gets to the third element of creating connection. So it's specificity, context, and connection. And the connection refers to literally building connections in the brain, because that's what behavior is it's neural connections. And most people are familiar with the concept of muscle memory, where you learn to swing a bat or ride a bike, but it really has nothing to do with muscles. It has to do with neurons, and the neurons being easier to fire. And so there's actually this, just like you have muscle memory in riding a bike, the thoughts that you have repeatedly become easier and easier to have, because the actual neurons that generate those thoughts become more tightly connected. And the neurons develop myelination, which makes it a lot easier for them to fire. And so the two, so you want to build those connections in the brain, and there's two ways to build connections in the brain. It's either through repetition, which you first mentioned, or actually, kind of to reverse what you just said, is emotion and putting people in a really high stakes environment. Obviously, if you're dealing with a client, you don't want the high stakes environment to be a situation where you're going to lose a client or do something illegal. But the brain is designed to keep you alive. And so, and if you can whether it's manufactured or not, create a situation where it actually can be really intense, that's where you cement that learning. And so you can imagine a situation where you give somebody some repetition at doing a task, but maybe before they themselves are 100% confident in it, throw them out with the wolves. Have a setup so that you are, your company is protected, but put them in a situation where they are going to feel uncomfortable or they are a little bit afraid, and get them through it in that setting. And that's what's really going to cement the learning.
Interesting. Yeah, because when you make that differentiation between repetition and high stakes, I'm sure everybody's got the story about how they never will forget learning something because,
Yes.
they broke something once, they screwed up this project, and they will never forget because they got chewed out by the client, by the boss, by whoever it was. It wasn't high stakes or high emotion when it first happened, but golly, they heard about it later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. And you obviously, you need to create the right situation for this stuff to happen. The thing that I always think about, again, from the Air Force, we had a training called Squadron Officer School. And this is something that you go to after between 6 and 8 years in the service, and you're with a group of about 12 other people who are with you, and you're learning all these leadership principles. And one of the things that you do is you go through this kind of like obstacle course, or it's a series of like physical puzzles where they're in these different bays, so you don't know what's in them, and then you get led in at the last second where somebody's designated the leader, and you have to solve a problem. But it's a problem where, like, you have to get all of your team from one side of a body of water to another, and you're like hanging from ropes or crawling across wooden planks that you have to figure out how to set it all up. And the whole setup is from like the 1970s, and so there's like exposed concrete everywhere, and it's like physically kind of dangerous. Like, people literally would break their arms like every now and then going through it. But so, like, not that everybody's going to do that, but it created this really high stakes, high pressure situation, which made it a lot easier to then remember and then in the future apply this kind of information. So, not that you can create emotion in a lot of different ways, and most of the time physical safety isn't the kind of thing that you want to threaten. But the point is that you do want to put thought into how do you create the right environment to teach people the skills that you want to teach them. And the more thought you put into it, the more likely it's going to be successful. That's the key thing, whether it's the Air Force or the Four Seasons, Disney. I recently listened to a podcast that was talking about training at the CIA. In the CIA, when they send their officers out to what they call the farm, which is where they train them, the ratio is approximately 1 student to 25 instructors.
Oh, wow.
Like that's a serious level of commitment. And not that we're all going to do that, obviously, but the point is that the more you think about it, the better, the higher the likelihood of success.
Wow. So, Matt, as we start closing down the interview, in creating the right environment, what's a good first step? How can we, as business owners, and even if we're just training the staff that we deal with and we're not the owner, what's a good first step for starting to build that environment?
I think it all comes back to thinking about the behavior, asking the question, what behavior are you trying to change? Because it's really easy to go off on tangents about some other form of information. But if you really focus on the behavior, that's how you're going to get the fastest results. And if you can make your entire learning and training structure focused on behavior, that's the surest way to have success.
Excellent. Matt, I will close things down there. Where can people find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn a lot, really. So if you, I post a lot on LinkedIn, very popular there. And then Better Everyday Studios is my consultancy. So bettereverydaystudios.com is where you can find me.
Great. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. You can find more info on us and get your free white paper on client service at 5starcouncil.com. You can get in touch with me at john@5starcouncil.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe wherever fine podcasts are found and leave us a review wherever you can.